Hello and welcome back to my model railroad. As you can see here, I've made pretty good progress and more or less completed one of my goals of being able to run one train around the table. Right now, this would be track 2, and as you can see here, with the exception of the 2 double crossovers I plan on having, the train will actually, run in a complete circuit. In the interim, what I've done is I've installed some Code 100 FlexTrack just so that way I don't mind wasting the pieces. These were some leftovers from my father-in-law. As you can see, I used my Code 83 to Code 100 rail joiners. They're not the best, they work decently enough. I wouldn't recommend them for your main line, but say for a siding or your rail yard, they'd probably work just fine. I've also just pinned the track in place. As you can see here, I haven't actually gone through and caulked these pieces down. Little bit of a sharp transition here, as you can see. I need to smooth this out a little bit, but this is all temporary anyway, so I'm not going to worry about it too much. One thing I did want to do is eventually create a video showing how I have laid track. But before I do that, I wanted to, with this video, show some problems, some difficulties I ran into, maybe save somebody else a little bit of heartache, and also maybe get some good feedback from everyone else out there. So one of the first things I'd mentioned is that I had chosen to use Code 83 FlexTrack. And I was told that as long as you had, decently recent trains, or, as long as you didn't have older European rolling stock, that everything should work just fine. Well, that wasn't necessarily the case. For instance, here's an example of, this is an AHM brand train that I got from my father-in-law, and I'm not even going to try to run it, but it's just, moving it with my hand, and you can see how it skips along the track. And what's actually happening is the flange on the wheels is skipping in between the ties on the railroad track. And in some cases, I can get these engines to run. In most cases, though, what'll end up happening is that they'll just, make that skipping noise down the track, and it's not good for the track, it's not good for the engine, and I pretty much, these engines are basically unusable at that point. I might go and actually install track 1 as Code 100 track just to be able to use some of them. But right now what I'm really trying to do is figure out how many engines are affected. Believe it or not, out of all of, I guess, my original engines, the only one that was affected was my favorite blue and white diesel. I wanted to pull that out, but I'm not even sure which box I boxed it up in. And so I just pulled out this one from my father-in-law. And so far I've identified 3 from him that don't work correctly, and I'm a little upset because some of them are nicer. This particular one isn't, but my goal was to be able to reuse everything. That was part of the reason why I even wanted to go with DC rather than DCC, was to be able to use all of my legacy equipment. So this really made me kind of take a step back and decide, well, what did I want to do in order, with the layout in order to progress forward? And I'm thinking that if I am going to have an instance where I'm not going to be able to run my old trains, I may as well start wiring the layout for DCC. I have no experience, very little knowledge on the subject. Let me just turn the train on have that running in the background. So one thing that I did when I was running the wires for this train, or for this whole track, is I had used this 22 gauge wire. It's actually stranded wire. I think I mentioned it in my other video. And I soldered it directly to the rail joiners, as you can see here. And this approach worked pretty well. Here's an example of what I did in the future tunnel area. As you can see, yes, it is this one, where I've taken these soldered rail joiners, the rail joiners with the feeder wires, and soldered them just to the bottom of the rail joiners, soldered the rail joiners in place of the track, and drilled some holes through my road bed here. This way you really can't see the feeder wires at all. It does look a little unsightly. This is one of the first ones I did, but it's also in the tunnel, so I'm not too concerned about it. And then just under the table here, you can see, here are the feeder wires. For DC, this shouldn't be much of an issue, because with DC, I'm only going to be running one train per loop, as you can see here. And the current draw is very small. It's right around 1.5 amps or so, I believe, is what my multimeter had. So, but if I want to run the train for DCC, then I'm going to need to create, I guess, what's called a bus which is, my giant spiderweb network of cables. And in that case, I'm going to be powering the whole layout with one power pack. And if that's the case, I want to use a little bit more of a heavy-duty wire. Because I might have multiple trains on the same track. Right now, as I think I'd mentioned, I was planning on having a feeder wire on each table, on each section of each table. So I'd have approximately 8 feeder wires. It's not quite as many as they recommend, but I figured for a layout this small, or of this size, it should be adequate. But in order to make sure that I wasn't going to eventually draw too much power in DCC, I actually went out and bought some 18 gauge wire and spent some time last week soldering it to the rail joiners. Now this is solid wire, so it's a little bit more, a little bit easier to work with actually, and a little bit more durable. Actually, what I was able to do, because I guess 18 gauge wire was a little harder to find, is I actually went out and bought thermostat wire. It comes in a double pair. I'm sorry, a pair of red and white. Red for right rail, make it easy. This 50 feet was about, I forget exactly how much it was, but I know it was under $20 on Amazon. It may have been closer to 10. So that's what I'm going to use for now powering all of track 3. For track 2, going back and changing how it's powered, I think what I might end up doing is just changing right here, adding in a set of powered rail joiners here in the layout, and then here, right where my 2 double crossovers will eventually sit. Well, coming in off the straight from the turn onto the straight, the double crossover will be here. There, and then also in the tunnel section of the layout over here, I was thinking about just soldering directly to the rails themselves. I don't like the approach of soldering directly to the rails. It's going to melt the ties a little bit, especially in track that I've already laid. Here was an example that I tried last weekend. This is my tester piece from a couple months ago, and I tried just soldering some rail joiners directly to it. Not some rail joiners, some feeder wires. Rather unsightly. If you can see here on this side, I managed to drip off a little bit of solder, melted the ties a little bit. Now, I'm not too concerned with the fact of it being in the tunnel of my layout, but that is one reason why I don't want to go and rewire the entire layout. I also don't want to go rip up all of the powered rail joiners that I had placed down. So for right now, what I'm thinking of doing is just having, one set here, one set there, and then one in the tunnel. The track is approximately a 60-foot circle. Not quite, it's probably closer to 50. So the way I'm figuring it is, this is approximately one end over there, and the tunnel's approximately the other end. So at most, your 2 are about 25 feet apart. So most the train itself would only be about 12, 13 feet away from a power source. I believe that is more than they recommend, but I figured going forward, it would, it's probably not going to kill me too much, especially on track 2 here. One of the other things I did want to mention is, since I took the approach of actually caulking down all the rails rather than using glue, as you can see here, I did start to get a little bit of caulk on the inside of the rails. I cleaned up most of this, but you can see here it's kind of messy. It was a little sloppy. You can see a nice bead of caulk here in between these rails here. And what I really had to do was take a snap blade and just clean all of the inside surfaces of these rails, all the top surfaces. I can detail my process later, but how I did this was actually go ahead and lay down the track all but about 6 or 8 inches from the edge, and then just wipe down some caulk, place the track on the caulk, take my T-pins, pin the track in place, and then let it sit for a day. For the rail joiners, I did solder every one. These ones are also some feeder wire ones. You can see here it's a little less sloppy as far as the road bed's concerned, and as far as the soldering is concerned. The ties don't look quite as great. What I ended up doing, rather than just sliding the ties underneath, I ended up cutting them. And you can see here then each tie is actually just 3 pieces, the little nib on each end and the center piece. There were some where I tried just shoving the ties under, but the little bumps on the ties were hitting it with the rail joiners and actually raising the whole track up a little bit. There were a couple other places where I tried just sanding the ties, but that wound up to be pretty cumbersome. It didn't look any better than just cutting them. I'm hoping the ballast will help smooth this out a little bit, and even though it does look a little unsightly, the approach that I'm taking is, I'm trying to model more the transition era. The rails weren't perfect. Some of the ties are going to be a little skewed, and my railroad will be no exception. So anyway, as you can see, I've also went ahead and laid the cork for track 3, and I was just about to start laying some track when I figured I should make a video documenting what I did on track 2 so far. I plan on making a video showing how I actually laid track for track 3, and once again, appreciate any questions or comments. I don't have a whole lot of track left. I have a whole bunch on order right now, but due to the global pandemic, I'm told it's going to be a while before I actually get any of the track in. So you can see right now, I want to start at the crossing here. Here's where the crossing would come in. I purposely made this piece much longer than it needed to be, so I know exactly that will be within one flex track length or less from the crossing. And I have just enough track to do from here around in the tunnel, and then once again to be about less than one piece of flex track away from the crossing on this end. So that's what I'm going to be working on this week. Fingers crossed that my order that I placed last week will be fulfilled, and that I'll be able to keep on laying track during this global crisis and pandemic. Hope everybody is safe and healthy, especially during these trying times. And once again, thanks for taking a look at my video, and I appreciate any questions and comments. And until then, I'll see you next time. Thank you.